What's going on, guys? This is VinylicPuma, back with another Borderlands 2 video for you guys, and today I've got something a bit different from what I would normally do on this channel, and that is a tier list ranking for all 48 legendary guns and weapons that the player can obtain in this game. Now real quick, and before we start, because we have 48 legendaries to go over, this video will be going over guns and weapons only, and will be including grenade mods. There will be no DLC limitations, and our rankings are going to be F through S or S through F, with F being the lowest tier and S being our highest tier. Also, this was a fun video to make, so if you did enjoy it, be sure to smash like, and if we get about 2,000 likes or so, I'll go ahead and I will make a sequel. Otherwise, guys, we've got a lot of legendaries to cover, so let's just jump in and discuss my F tier rankings. So F tier consists of legendaries that are best described as being pretty terrible. These legendaries either have no redeeming qualities whatsoever, or they just end up being too weak to really be viable, and for those reasons, they really should be avoided. Starting off, we have the Madhouse, which is a banded assault rifle that has a wobbly projectile pattern in addition to a ricochet ability that spawns 2 projectiles upon the initial projectile hitting a surface. The ricochet would be good, but the ricochets spawn at like 45-degree angles, ensuring that you're never going to hit anything. Next, we have the Nasty Surprise, which is actually kind of cool in that it's a longbow Merv that teleports grenades to an enemy's feet, but the damage and grenade count is low, so it's not really worth using. There's the Rolling Thunder, which is just awful as it's a rubberized grenade that explodes as it bounces, ensuring that A, you'll never hit anything, and B, that you may even end up hurting yourself while using it. And finally, there's the Bunny, which is quite possibly the worst legendary in the game, as it's a TDR launcher that has an uncontrollable bunny hopping-like reload that can more often than not kill the player. Overall, F tier is pretty depressing, as some of these legendaries like the Madhouse and Nasty Surprise could be good, but they're just bad, and hence that's why they're F tier. Also, let me know if you wish the Nasty Surprise was a lot better than it currently is in the comments section below. Moving on, we have the E tier, or as I like to call it, the egregious tier. Maybe that's a bit harsh since none of these are F tier, but they aren't exactly D tier either. In general, a lot of E-tier legendaries have some redeemable qualities or are interesting conceptually, but in practice, they're really just not worth the time and effort to farm. Case in point, the Shred-a-Fire, which is basically just a better version of the Vladov spinning gun ARs that were never really that great in the first place. That said, the Shred-a-Fire does look awesome though, and hence, that's why it's E-tier. There's the Logan's gun, which is both visually interesting and can serve as a great way to regenerate rocket ammo, but it possesses a bizarre design that makes the bullets miss when aimed normally, and requires you to aim at people's feet, which is just really weird. We also have the Pyrophobia in this tier, which has a cool but impractical projectile pattern, the Striker, which is supposed to be a sniper shotgun that unfortunately lost its magazine size between games, the Sledge's shotgun, which lost its knockback abilities between games, the Pandemic, which is a corrosive-only grenade that has some neat homing projectiles that just take way too long to reach targets, and finally, there's the Emperor, which was actually a pretty decent legendary at one time, but became relegated to E tier simply because it was already the weakest legendary SMG, and then the Sandhawk came out, which is just way better and is a quest reward. Ultimately, maybe we should call E tier the Emperor tier. After all, none of these guns are awful per se and may have some redeeming qualities, but compared to other legendaries and other weapons, I think you can do a lot better. Now D tier, unlike previous tiers, contains weapons that I would consider to be viable and possibly worth using. However, many of these items are held back by major flaws and issues such as wonky projectiles, inferior damage compared to other weapons, or just other issues. For example, the Volcano Sniper Rifle is largely held back by its low base damage, and because of that, many purple rarity Meluon snipers end up outperforming it on criticals. Or in the case of the Kerblaster, it's actually capable of some decent damage, but it can't crit, and you have to rely on a secondary grenade to explode near enemies, as otherwise, you'll lose out on about 50% plus of the total amount of damage that you can deal. This theme even extends to things like the Skull Masher, which is just held back by its projectile multiplier, the Bonnie, which deploys Murph grenades that inadvertently make it more difficult to use, or the Hammer Buster, which is decent but is non-elemental and is largely outperformed by other more common Jacobs rifles like the Gatling gun. Another great example is a weapon like the Quasar, which, like everything else we've mentioned, isn't really bad, but it's simply not as powerful or as useful as its non-unique counterparts. After all, I'd prefer to have a Slag Singularity Grenade, as it's functionally similar and provides a debuff, while the Quasar just gets a Tesla effect, which is just less useful in my opinion. In the end, gear from D tier isn't necessarily terrible and might actually be worth farming in some cases, but for the most part, I think you're going to be able to do without a lot of these legendaries. Now this brings us to our next tier, which is the C tier. So the C tier is our largest tier with the most entries, and to best describe a lot of these weapons, many of them are what could be considered good legendaries, but they're simply not quite as desirable or as powerful as their higher tier counterparts. So I suppose sort of like your C grade that you might receive in school, many of these legendaries are just average. Because of that, there's not really very many, if any, huge downsides to these weapons, and to some degree, you could argue those downsides weren't really that big of a deal in the first place. Case in point, I'd consider the Longbow C tier, as it's a pretty decent legendary sniper that's really only held back by its lack of a scope and fire elemental exclusivity, which aren't really huge issues. The same could be said of other weapons like the Hellfire, Hornet, and Gub, as all three are pretty good weapons, but they're held back by elemental exclusivity, and they aren't especially mind-blowing in terms of raw power or special effects. You've also got weapons like the Slagga in this tier, which is really good at slagging enemies, but isn't as great as a main offensive weapon. The Invader, which is a pretty decent sniper rifle for zero players, that's really only held back by its weapon sway, and some may not like the burst fire on it. The Mongol, which has a cool special effect that spawns more rockets as the initial rocket travels, but is really only useful at longer distances. The Leech, which can heal the player instantly without orbs, but is weaker than other transfusion grenades. The Fire Bee, which is decent, but is more or less useful depending on the surface it deploys on. And the Varuk, which is a pretty decent assault rifle with a ×3 projectile multiplier that reaches ×5 while aiming down sights. Only for the weapon to have a horizontal projectile pattern that some may not be super crazy about. Again, and in all of these cases, I don't think any of these weapons are really bad per se, so much as they are either not as desirable as some of the later tier legendaries, or they just have a few undesirable aspects about them that really aren't that big of a deal anyway. That said, I would consider the Deliverance, which did make this tier, to be borderline, and I'd say it skews more towards D tier. It's not terrible, but it's sort of lacking thanks in part to how it was based off of the TDR barrel for shotguns. So I suppose if there was one C tier weapon that is a little suspect, it might be the Deliverance, but even then, I'd still recommend getting it since it's a T-door shotgun that flies through the air shooting targets. If you ask me, many weapons in C tier are pretty good overall and are worth seeking out, so be sure to keep an eye out for these as they're worth picking up if they do drop. But now we should talk about B tier. I think this tier could be best described as the slightly above average tier for legendaries, in that many of these are better than the weapons that reside in C tier, but they lack a certain greatness and/or desirability that makes them worthy of being in the highly desirable A and S tiers. One weapon that comes to mind is the Infinity Pistol, which despite its tendency to be a little overrated, is actually a very good weapon functionally due to its infinite ammo and high fire rate. Another example might be the Ogre, which is a pretty good explosive assault rifle from Torg, but is made less desirable due to how hard it is to actually get one. You also have something like the Firestorm, which is a fairly powerful fire grenade that regenerates its own ammo, but is held back by the delay between the initial explosion and the subsequent raining fireballs. Other weapons like the Pitchfork, Thunderball Fists, and Maggie are pretty good weapons all around, they just tend to be not quite as popular as some of the other legendaries that reside in the higher tiers, or even other weapons within Borderlands 2 itself. In fact, there are a few B tier weapons that ended up being relegated to B tier simply due to the fact that there are just other weapons out there that are either better or more popular. For example, the Nukem is a pretty powerful rocket launcher, but there are better legendary launchers out there. And when it comes to something like the bonus package, it ultimately became less desirable with the inclusion of the Seraph Meteor Shower, which is essentially the same thing, but is easier to get and is a little bit more powerful. If you get any of these, I'd say you'll be pretty happy because a lot of B-tier legendaries are usually pretty powerful. However, I think they are outdone by A-tier legendaries, which we can discuss now. So A-tier legendaries are among some of the very best weapons in Borderlands 2, and while they aren't as distinguished as their S-tier counterparts, A-tier legendaries are still pretty desirable. A-tier includes the likes of the Chain Lightning, Stormfront, Gunnerang, Bada Boom, Conference Call, Flacker, Babymaker, and the Many of these weapons are either A, really powerful in certain situations, or B, are among the top 3 or 5 of their respective weapon types. As far as the former standard goes, weapons like the Gunnerang, Babymaker, and Flacker come to mind, as the Gunnerang and Babymaker are capable of powerful and fast reloads, while the Flacker greatly benefits from its glitch potential with Torg rocket launchers, which can be used to greatly improve its damage. As for everything else within this tier goes, I think it's fair to say that they're among some of the best their respective weapon types have to offer. After all, the is easily in the top 5 as far as SMGs go, and may even be in the top 3 with the Tattler and Sandhawk. The Conference Call is number 2 behind the Interfacer, the Bada Boom is number 2 behind a certain legendary that we'll be discussing shortly, and the Chain Lightning and Stormfront are definitely in the top 5 grenades due to the former's regenerative capabilities and the latter's high popularity amongst the player base and just its general usefulness. Ultimately, the A-tier weapons are pretty good weapons and are among some of the best in their class. That said, they aren't S-tier, which is the final tier that we're going to be discussing. In my mind, what makes a weapon truly S-tier is that it's not only a really powerful weapon on its own, but it's a weapon that's amazing regardless of character choice, and it is the best single weapon of its respective weapon type. So for example, an S-tier pistol is not only an amazing legendary weapon, but it's great regardless of character build and also just so happens to be the best pistol in the entire game. Speaking of pistols, I think it's pretty obvious that the Unkempt Herald is easily S-tier, as both regular and double penetrating variants are ridiculously powerful and are arguably an essential weapon to have for any build. There's also the Norfleet, which, like the Unkempt Herald, is easily S-tier thanks in large part to it being the single best rocket launcher in the game, and again, being an essential and highly desirable weapon to have for any build. There's also the Fastball Grenade, which in terms of raw power is the strongest grenade mod in the game, and thus, I think it's worthy of being S-tier. However, and with that said, I will admit that it's not the best grenade for every scenario, as some enemies like Saturn seem to be really resistant to it. The one S-tier legendary I think you could say has the most contested position is the Lyuda. The thing is, both the Lyuda and Pimpernel are so good that it's pretty difficult to declare a winner for the single best sniper in Borderlands 2. However, the Lyuda is still like the Unkempt Herald and Norfleet in that it's a highly recommended weapon to have for any character or build, and thus, I think it's still worthy of its S-tier ranking. That, and it's the best legendary sniper, so I'll give it an S-tier ranking. At the end of the day, I think it's fair to say that S-tier is the cream of the crop in Borderlands 2, and these are all weapons you really should go after in endgame. So be sure to check them out when you get the opportunity. Okay guys, that's going to wrap up this tier list video. Remember, if you want to see more tier lists like this, definitely be sure to hit that like button, and also let me know what your favorite legendary is in the comment section below. Otherwise, like this video if you liked it, click the bell so you can be notified when I upload more Borderlands videos, and as always, and again, thank you all so much for supporting this channel, take care, and I'll see you all in the next one.